With God, there is always more. More love, more life, more freedom. Welcome to Zoweh's Exploring More with Michael Thompson. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "Our Heavenly Father has provided many delightful inns for us along our journey, but He takes great care to see that we do not mistake any of them for home." Join me and the team as we explore the kingdom together, discovering the deep truths and offering encouragement for the journey. There is always more. Welcome, friends and allies, to the Exploring More podcast with Michael Thompson. Michael Thompson here, hanging out with S.J. Jennings, Jim Chenet, and Gary Barkalow. Man, this is a good lineup, S.J. We've got some good ones engaged with us today to talk about this elder sage stage, the part of the masculine journey when men are kind of moving into a different kind of space. And so Jim and I've been talking about this for months. SJ, you know a little bit about this. Gary, you know, because there's a part of the Noble Heart. You've been giving attention to this the past few years in your fourth quarter initiative. And so we just thought it'd be good. We know it's going to be important to just come together and talk about this and explore more. What is it that God has for men in their 60s and 70s and 80s? What does it look like to be an elder and a sage? So we thought we would talk about it for the next couple of episodes and share some things with our listeners and our friends. Yeah, welcome, guys. Good to have you on board. And we're doing this in a Zoom call. Gary's in Colorado Springs, Jim's in Chapel Hill, SJ's in Virginia. And,
I do not live in Virginia. Anything that's 15 minutes away from Durham is
it's either South Carolina
or something.
Yeah, South Carolina, Virginia, or Georgia. If you're 30 minutes away from me, you're that much closer to those states, depending on what direction.
Yeah.
So, or you live on the coast, anybody that's just a little bit east of Raleigh. So,
I wonder, Michael, if we want to just take a second, if you and Jim could share where this came from, how this came about, that Zoweh's moving in this direction. And Gary, you talk about the fourth quarter. I mean, I'd love to hear the story, Jim and Michael, of how this came about. And also your story, Gary, is how the fourth quarter initiatives came to be.
Let me say a couple of things, Jim, and then give it to you. So writing this new book, working on King Me, there's a part of this book that breaks down kind of the masculine journey as I've learned it from Gordon Dalby and from John Eldredge and from others that have written about these, even Iron John Bly, I think is his last name.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not new, but I believe that it's one of those conversations that needs to keep coming up and needs to be revisited. And it's definitely a part of my story and journey that I've wanted to reclaim places in my journey, younger years, things that happened to me, wounding things I chose badly. So all of that to say, it's part of the book called King Me, and the longing that I believe every man has and woman, but the masculine longing for validation and initiation, and that there's different appropriate stages. If you divide your life up by decades, you've got 6-7 stages that you're moving through, and there's appropriate things in each stage, and your heart's being handled by others in every one of those stages. And at some point, God can enter into the story and become. It's so wild to me now, more so than ever, that He wanted Himself known as Father. I mean, the Trinity's Father, Son, and Spirit, but the Father, God wants to be known as Father. Very, very significant conversation in all of that. So that's kind of the backdrop. And as I began to look at the elder sage stage, and I shared with Jim, who has been a big brother, uncle, and an elder in the journey of my life and the journey of Zoweh's mission and ministry. 15 years now, Jim? Maybe more, 18?
15 with Zoweh and 18 with you.
Yeah. I just approached him and said, I think we need to talk about this. I don't see many elders at the gate, that the scriptures talk about. I don't see many men in their, the last couple of decades of their lives actually being invited in to share what they know. There's characters that I love in films. There's characters that I love in the world that are elders, but it doesn't seem like there are as many of them as I feel like there should be. So that took me to this question, why? What's going on? So I talked to Jim about what if we could give some attention to this, and what would it look like to do that? So that's the open whiteboard, if you will, that I presented to Jim. And yeah, Jim, you can share your thoughts, reactions to that.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are two routes to this initiative, this discussion. One route is, as you said earlier, Gary's been working on fourth quarter for a couple of years now. And that's always been interesting to us, especially as we get older. And the other route is I started working with Michael more on a full-time basis when I, quote unquote, retired or left my sales business role assignment and switched assignments over to be more involved with Zoweh. And Michael started working on his book, King Me, shortly after that. And me not being in that stage any longer, I started thinking about that next stage, that sage stage, and started teasing Michael that his next book, and 5 years from now, is going to be Sage Me or something like that. And so he took the tease and said, well, why don't you start developing some ideas around it? Over the last year, I've talked to Gary at events and talked to some of the other older guys and put together 2 or 3 or 4 pages of kind of an outline, and Michael's edited it and we've shown it to a couple of people, and it's gotten a lot of excitement, especially from guys who are wondering, how can I use my giftedness, my glory in my later years? Yeah. So Gary, tell us about the fourth quarter part.
Yeah.
As I look back at the men that came to the calling retreats, weekends that we did, I look back over years and I realized that 95% of those who came were 45 years or older. In fact, 99% were probably 55 and over.
Oh.
And I realized that it was that stage, that age range, where the men were really wanting to pursue, who am I really? What do I have to bring outside of what the corporate world or the church world is telling me that I have to bring? And younger guys did come, but it was mostly older men that were very tuned in, very passionate about finding this out for their life versus just for a career. And so, as I kept watching this and observing this, and of course, hearing hundreds and hundreds of men's stories as we do in these calling retreats, I realized how many men were feeling directionless in their lives as they realized they were getting toward the end of their career. And not that they were thinking retirement, but they were watching what was happening to them in their world of their career, being sidelined a little bit more, not being asked as many questions, not being asked in as many meetings. Younger guys kind of giving that look to the older guys of, yeah, you really don't know how this operates anymore. You're in a different generation. And I could see them wondering, well, then who am I really if I have to now define my own life? And I don't mean alone apart from God, but with God. So this started this. Now, the other incentive is, as you brought up, I am in that stage range right now, age-wise. And I watch guys, whose passions are 20-year-olds, 20-somethings until they turn 30, and then it's 30-somethings until they turn 40. And so you're right about that. But my heart goes to that generation. In fact, I'm very involved in my church, and the times when I really do teach from the pulpit, I am really teaching to the kings and the sages is who I'm really drawn to speak to.
I think that's well said. And this is what we want to talk about in this series. What is it that they're up against? What are they feeling? Like you were saying, Gary, what's culture doing to them in the West, particularly? There's been an evolution, obviously, of the last several decades. People don't grow up in their hometowns. They don't live in another part of a city that their parents are across town, or even, back in the cities when you come into the 1920s and 30s. I mean, you see film and story about that. I mean, they're all living in the brownstone, at different levels. Yeah. And grandparents are part of the story and the family, especially when you see old Europe immigrate into this new America. But here we are 80, 100 years later, and it's a very different time. And there's just certain markers, when you look at Social Security, when you look at retirement, and how many more people, I can't imagine what the statistic is, how many more people are in the stock market, right? How many more people we have these retirement funds and stuff. So we're not really going to talk about all that in this time. But Jim, I want to tell a story before we go on. So I had breakfast with a man yesterday who is in his late 60s. Cracker Barrel, good for everybody. And so we're having our hash brown casserole, and he's been a friend and a engaged participant in Zoweh the last few years. And he really is an admirer, but also wants to connect with Zoweh and what we're doing. And so we had talked and caught up a little bit. It had been a few months since we'd had breakfast. And so I said, well, I'd like to pitch something to you. I'd like to share a vision and an invitation that I would like for you to consider coming with me and 10 or 11 other good men in this, what we're calling the Elder Sage Project. And then I went on to describe a few elements, Jim, with him about, making that fourth quarter count, moving from the book, moving from success to significance, right? Halftime. I mean, there's been some things that have touched on this, but to really kind of move into this and to create a space for the elders and sages to experience healing still in their stories. And then in the same space, help them have a platform, have a voice, knowing what we get to do, SJ. We know a lot of kings and a lot of warriors because of our resources, because of our events. We have a lot of 30, 40, 50-year-olds. I like what you said, Gary. There's something about calling and the glory of your life that seems to drop into our stories a little bit later. And it's still very much about who am I? But so many of our guys, 30s, 40s, and 50s, are exploring that question, at least from the false self standpoint, and wanting to get these things out of the way, the woundedness, the agreements, the subscriptions that they've made with the enemy, all of that. So back to my friend, and he's been to a few conferences, and I said, if there is something there, and I believe there is, to resurrect, Jim and myself and a few of us we're exploring what would that look like and how might that be, and would love to have you consider being at that round table. And I look at him, tears. And I said, wow, what are the tears? He has a company, he has several employees, son's in the business. I said, what are the tears? And he said, you got to do this. You got to do this. And I do want to be a part of it. I'm honored. These tears I'm honored to be invited. And I think that phrase, that idea is at the fear of an elder sage, some maybe part of his greatest fear. And it's part of the greatest way to honor someone in that stage is to be invited in and to speak and to share what you know, what you've learned. I talked about the holy regrets that you might have, not to live under the shame of regret, but to see those regrets as something that can invite resurrection, can invite healing, can invite redemption, and those that are involved in whatever regrets there are. And it was an important moment for me, but I could see that it was an important moment for him.
Michael, as you say that, use the word regret. Regret is something we don't want to live with that can handicap, paralyze a person, but it is such a useful tool,
Amen.
Right? To look at the things that I would regret and then ask the question, why? What does that say about you? What does it say about life? What does it say about your walk with God? And so for this man, to have tears in a sense of regret says, wow, there is something in you that God wants to have alive, that you are to offer. I just think regret is a very powerful tool. It's powerful either direction.
Right. Whichever kingdom wants to use it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's true.
What's kind of interesting about this whole thing is this whole discussion is we've all had bosses or mentors or coaches who have tried to help us or poured into our lives or help us achieve our goals. But this whole saging thing is different in the sense that the goals that a sage that I think we're talking about are more eternal goals, and they're not worldly goals.
Mm-hmm.
And so while we've had some experience, we really haven't had any experience with saging. Not so long ago, as you said earlier, people retired and then died. The life expectancy as people are healthier and living longer. But as a result of not having a focus on this stage earlier, we don't have any role models. So, when you say to a person who's been a sage in your life, for me, it's hard to think of somebody, really, because It's just not been, the sage kind of thing that we're talking about has not been very prevalent, unfortunately.
Michael, you started our conversation bringing up the triple deckers and, the early part of the 20th century where 3, sometimes 4 generations of a family would live together. And I wonder, as we have gone through as a country, into the 50s and 60s and suburban sprawl and this idea that we're more isolated, not always necessarily in a negative way, but, parents live in one house, grandparents live in another house, the kids live in another house, as opposed to all living on a 3 or 4 level home. And I wonder with that isolation, if that is part of the reason for this idea that men and women retire and then pass away. It's like once their purpose is gone, their reason for living is gone. And when you're living in a house full of 3 or 4 generations, you are the one that people come to when they really need wisdom. You're kind of thrust into that role in that scenario, right? And that way of living, that family model, that family unit is essentially gone. So I wonder if that's part of the reason, Jim and Gary, that men, women, they kind of lose their purpose because it's not right there in front of them the way it used to be.
Yes.
All of that, I believe, is true in the sociology of it and looking at the developmental stages or the breakdown of the family. All of that stuff, SJ, that you're mentioning, those are contributing pieces. Jim, there's a correlation between how far back do you want to go in the masculine journey? Like we were talking about, how many good kings are there? If there's a shortage of good kings, well, then what?
Yeah.
There's a shortage.
There's going to be a shortage of elder sages because it's the graduation to this stage. And so, Gary, bringing your comments back into this, if there are men in their 60s and 70s that are needing, and I understand that are needing to find clarity of calling, of identity, of the larger story, crud, man, that's what we should have been able to see happen in somebody's 30s in earlier stages. So you're really inadvertently talking about some of the components that make this challenging, why we might feel like it's so important to resurrect. Because in principle, this is still very, very important. Because for us, elder sages are men who have walked with God. They know what it's like to experience the intimacy with God, the assault, the attacks of the enemy, what redemption in their lives have looked like, and can live to tell about it. So when I say we don't have enough good kings, we don't. Because they're late to their recovery. They're late to their restoration. So what would it look like to see every generation reclaimed, but particularly kings and elders? Because it's the kings who have young explorers and young warrior sons and daughters, right? And if the king doesn't know who he is, where he is, or the good God's up to in his life, what we have talked about for podcasts regarding orientation, then my point is then you can have a disoriented elder sage. And yet, what is it to encourage them? Like you said, Gary, it's in their story. Their glory's in there. So is the assault. And what if we could help redemption, reclaiming that identity? And it's not too late. I think that's one of the battle cries of the elder sage. If I could put it on one side of a coin or put it on the bottom of a flag, it's not too late. It's not too late.
Well, I think that's part of the reaction you got at your breakfast the other day. When you invited that man into this, Michael, I think that's the other part of the reaction. The regrets maybe is one side, but to be invited into an endeavor like this, an initiative like this, I know the guy you're talking about, I'm sure his heart just came alive at that. So the idea that it's not too late, I still have something to contribute and someone still wants me to contribute it.
Yeah. So let's kind of define what an elder sage is.
Let's do that right after a break.
Yeah. Thanks for keeping time, SJ, keeping us on track. So, hey, we will we'll define elder sage with a couple very good elder sage men in Jim Chenet and Gary Barkalow when we come back in just a second. Be right back.
Hey, listeners, it's SJ. Just want to give you an update on upcoming events in 2021. You know, the purpose of Zoweh events is to create a safe space where men, women, and couples can encounter God, experience Him in wonderfully intimate ways, and enter into life-changing transformation. We want to invite you to get away with God, unplug from all the noise, the busyness, and the demands of everyday routine, and invite Jesus to take you through your story. The moments or seasons in your life that He wants to heal and restore in order to shape you more fully into who you truly are. That happens over and over again throughout the Bible. Regular folks encounter an incredible God, experience His love, and they are never the same. We have 3 events coming up in 2021. March 18th through the 21st is our Heart of a Warrior Allies Advanced Weekend. April 8th through the 11th is the Women's Deepening Weekend. And then April 29th through May 2nd is the Heart of a Warrior Encounter for Men. Visit zoweh.org/events for more information.
Welcome back to the Exploring More podcast, talking about elders and sages, talking about this redemption and reclaiming this part of the masculine journey with Gary Barkalow and Jim Chenet, board members, team members, Zoweh brothers, Noble Heart Neighboring Kingdom. I mean, let's talk about this idealistically just for a few minutes or for what we have left in this episode. What should this be like?
Well, you already said it several times, and that is a man must be walking intimately with Jesus Christ in his life. So that's the most important part of the definition that I can think.
Okay.
And I would think in that, in many ways, if I were to define just with one phrase what an elder sage does, that is, I would say he fathers.
Yeah.
He fathers
That's
those
good.
around him.
Yeah.
Michael talks a lot about blessing and initiating, and fathering is right there. So, yep.
And a really secure, as you would say, Michael, a very settled father can listen, can ask questions, is not easily offended, will journey with a person. So the person gets to a good place or the truth. I think it's just very different than someone younger who needs a person to arrive at the right answer, the truth immediately, and is easily offended because they're not listened to, versus a man who is older, who understands what the journey is really like and is very compassionate about it because he knows that people do not change overnight, because they know they didn't change overnight.
Right.
There was much grace extended to them, so they can extend grace.
Yeah.
And as you often talk about, humility is just the very core of all of this.
Yeah.
I think we also mentioned that he is a man who has experienced the masculine journey, but more than experienced it, he has examined it, reflected on it. He has gone back to his experiences and tried to see what God was doing in those things.
In the definition of sage, it is a man who reflects well.
Yeah.
We love movie clips. And as Jim and Gary were describing a sage, and in particular, as Gary was talking about, it's not so much giving advice and counsel so that a person can get to the right answer, but it's just walking with someone and imparting wisdom as you walk. And of course, I think of Mr. Miyagi, right? Immediately. I love the fact that in that movie, The Karate Kid, the first one, I haven't even really watched the sequels, but the first one, he's teaching Daniel all along how to fight karate, but Daniel just thinks he's learned how to wax a car and paint a fence. You know, so it's this wisdom of walking through life. And at the right moment, right, I think sages are great at this, the ones that I've interacted with. It's the big reveal, you know, like, no, you haven't been painting the fence. You haven't been sanding the floor. I've been teaching you karate the whole time, dude. You know, it's just, I love that idea. I love that.
And what's best is if he didn't even have to say it.
Yeah.
He saw it finally.
One of the things that we've alluded to already is something that a sage implanted in my life years ago. And that was this idea that we do not learn from experience, we learn from evaluated experience. And he would say, you know, there are people that are in their 60s, 70s, 80s who have had decades of experience and they know very little.
Amen.
But there are those who are younger that have examined their experience to learn, to understand what was God up to? What was he revealing about who I am and how he operates? There's where wisdom comes in, and that develops an elder sage. And to throw out one other thing, Michael, I've never thought about this, but though we have many older people, we don't have many sages because they were not good kings. As you were saying that, I thought, we have some kings that we need to say, you're going into your elder years, you need to take a gap year. You need a gap year because you are not ready for the elder sage stage yet, or university.
A remedial year.
Yeah. Like you said, every stage transition almost needs that, Gary, truly. From warrior to king. Okay, you need a gap year. Because there's some things coming that the old sword, as comfortable as it is, we need to make some shifts and some adjustments. Same thing from boyhood to the explorer to the warrior. So I'm with you there. I think about, as we define good ones, what's a good one look like? Wisdom hard earned, and that comes through the reflection, walking intimately with God. And I know you're saying this, Jim, and I'm just going to say it this way. In that way, recovering from the wounds and the agreements and the vows that they've made in their younger years, because that healing is so much a part of the training for a good king, for a elder sage. And he gets to bring that and begin to look on the landscape of masculinity and femininity, of men and of women, and wonder, God, who am I to invite? Who am I to share? And the other thing I think they know, Jim, is they know the lowest seat at the table. They know it.
Humility.
That's right. And like musical chairs, they will fight to get in it.
Yeah.
They want to be in that place. But it doesn't mean they don't want to be called up. It just means they know the position in which they want to start and come from. So I think that invitation to be called up and called in, and what do you know? Like you said, Gary, if it's examined, then they are our storytellers, right? You don't want a guy just coming in telling you what to do. You want somebody who can tell you a story from their life of what they learned and how they learned it, how expensive it might have been. And they're there to tell you in that narrative way. I remember when I was, or let me tell you a story about, I think that craft is so different. And we're back to these other elements, SJ. Story's not a lost art. It's just definitely getting assaulted by facts and by the amount of information that we get. But it's still wild. Book sales are still up. Movies, even though we can't go to the theater, we still love to be a part of a story, to get caught up in a story, even for a little while, And so stories like Karate Kid, right? We have characters that remind us of how important this character is. We have characters that represent the importance of this role in many larger stories. And I want to give one more that we can talk about. Talk about Lionel Logue just a little bit. Who's Lionel Logue?
King's Speech.
I think his picture's in the yearbook of Elder Sage University, right? He might be one of the faculty members. Miyagi's in there, right?
He makes it clear that he doesn't have any initials after his name, PhD or doctor of this or that he is the guy who has learned by experience. And I love
experience.
Examine experience. And that's what I was going to say. I love what we're saying. And I think we got to make it crystal clear that we're saying you do not have to have lived a perfect life.
Right.
Be a good sage. As a matter of fact, take a look at the Apostle Peter. He says to Jesus, no, you don't want to do that. You don't want to go to the cross. And that's not true. Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Or he says at the Transfiguration, I'm going to build an altar or a table or something. Jesus says, come on, Peter.
Yeah. In 1 Peter, he says, hey, guys, be humble.
Yeah.
The devil walks around like a roaring lion.
Yes.
So those guys are in the faculty pages as well. Those letters were written 40 years, give and take, 40 and 50 years after the resurrection. They're elders.
Amen.
They're sages, and they're writing letters to young Christians about, here's what I know. I was there. Here's what he did. Yeah. So Lionel Logue, Gary, what do you think?
Yeah, to me, we've named a few really good pictures of elder sages. The most current modern one, if you will, in films would be Lionel Logue in The King's Speech. I love the fact that he is not intimidated. Yes, he was shocked when he heard that the man that came in his office, was of royalty. he was shocked, but after that, he was not intimidated. It didn't mean anything to him anymore. He could speak to the king in a way that no one else would. And he knew how to help this man.
Yeah.
When the king walked away in anger, he didn't plead for him to come back. He just waited for him to come back. He knew that he had the answer to this man's life. And he was the only man in his life that would actually speak honestly and work with him. I mean, it was just such a great picture of that. And he didn't capitalize on who he was working with, right? It wasn't the new now promotion marketing scheme to get his name out there and get more clientele.
Mm-hmm.
That had nothing to do with what he was doing. He's just such a great picture of humility, strength, experience, healing in his own life. And therefore, he understood the healing process.
Yeah.
He understood woundedness. What a great picture.
Yeah. If one side of the banner as we wrap up about this is it's not too late, so helping elder sages get their hearts back, that's still a part of this stage. The gap year, to see a man stay on the path of recovery and restoration, because it's not over. It's not over for him. It's never too late, right? To me, that's part of the war cry. But I think the other part, they would have a State Farm symbol on their jacket somewhere. We know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. And I think that's the beauty of that elder sage. Those miles aren't wasted.
Lionel Logue's a great example with the returning war veterans that he dealt with.
Yeah, could somebody help those poor buggers?
Right. I think the elder sage passage to me, and I'm asking you guys to respond to this, Jim and Gary, that one of the beautiful passages I want to capture is in 1 Peter 5, which I mentioned earlier. And that is, be prepared to give an answer for the hope that's within you. And do it with gentleness and respect. When I read that in my 30s, I thought it was an evangelistic passage. At 56, and I hear that, no, this is about wise counsel. This is about being in a position that because you've reflected, because you've walked with God, because you know a thing or two about a thing or two, God's going to bring you men and women because you're ready to handle the hearts of men and women.
There's almost an expectation in the warrior stage and the king stage, maybe in all the stages, that a certain amount of brashness, boldness, confidence, is what you need to project in order to be, quote unquote, successful. And as you just said, that's almost the opposite of what we're hoping for in the sage stage. The humility, the gentleness, the compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, several months ago, this man I mentioned who'd mentioned me for many years, and I've mentioned him in other podcasts we've done, Paul Stanley, passed away. And going to his memorial service was phenomenal. I saw people I knew that I had no idea that knew Paul, and they talked about the effect he had in their life. And it was fascinating. For an hour and a half to 2 hour memorial service, they spent maybe 3 minutes kind of talking about his history, if you will, his resume. 95%, probably more like 99% of the time, it was talking about his character. And it was amazing. He was a man, and talking about, this idea of, you're given certain authority by organizations and so on, but a sage has personal authority, right? Because his walk with God. He was the kind of guy that walked in the room and you knew he was there, right? You knew it. I could turn around and go, I feel like Paul Stanley came in the room, and turn around, he'd be right there at the door. His presence, it was palpable. And it was even palpable during that memorial service because of the man he was. And though he had done remarkable things, his resume did not give him the power, the authority. It was the life that he lived. He walked with God, the way he lived with people. He was remarkable.
That's sweet. That's so good. I want to say to you, Gary and Jim, we've got more to talk about. We'll do some more in these next couple episodes, but I'm grateful for you. I know SJ is, and many, many other men are grateful for you and this stage that you're in now, and how you're learning to wield influence, to listen, to care, and you both are doing it well. And I'm so hopeful that as we awaken men a little earlier, king stage, warrior stage, maybe even a little younger than that, that the good that can come from talking about this could become part of a movement regarding this. And I want to be a part of that. And I want to be a part of it with you guys. So SJ, anything else as we close it out?
No, I agree and echo all of that. And Gary, I'm sorry for the loss of your friend, but you shared about him so beautifully, and
Yeah, it was
so
honoring.
appreciate that. And yeah, we're honored that you would share that with us and our listeners. Jim, thank you for what you had for us. Listeners, if you've got questions or comments for us, please send us an email at exploringmore@zoweh.org. And on the podcast platform of your choice, if you'd leave us a rate and a review, helps us to get found and helps get the word out about the message of Zoweh. So thanks for being with us today.
Yeah. Hey, we're going to jump into the next session, and it's going to be about the wounding of the elder sage and the healing of the elder sage. So join us next week for the Exploring More podcast. And remember, with God, there's always more. We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Exploring More. The landing page for this podcast is zoweh.org/podcast. That's ZOWEH.org/podcast, where you can find the show notes and various platforms to which we broadcast. You can also find us and the life of more by visiting Zoweh on YouVersion Bible app, Right Now Media, our Facebook page, and Zoweh on Instagram and Twitter. Remember, with God there is always more, and you were made for more.